to mainstream systemic risk assessment in policy and decision-making in response to current and future challenges. Hosted by the United Nations Foundation, we are an independent initiative set up to advance the field and practice of systemic risk and to advocate for transformative action for the prosperity of all people, societies, species, and ecosystems. We are home to a global network of over 90 risk practitioners and thought leaders drawn from across sectors, disciplines, worldviews, genders, geographies, and generations. Today, we're really pleased to host Professor Thomas Homer-Dixon, also known as TAD. TAD is founder and executive director of Cascade Institute, a Canadian research center addressing the full range of humanities converging environmental, economic, political, technological, and health crises. Using advanced methods for mapping and modeling complex global systems, the Institute identifies and helps implement high-leverage interventions that could rapidly shift humanity's course towards a fair and sustainable future. TAD is also an ASRA member, along with many of his colleagues at Cascade. Today, TAD will guide us through new insights from Cascade's Polycrisis core model, PCM, a breakthrough framework for understanding how today's overlapping global crises interact to shape our future. We're super excited to host this conversation today. In our work, we often face a paradox. The clearer we see systemic risks, the harder it can be to maintain the sense of agency needed to act on them. So this new work from Cascade offers something we all need: hope, grounded not in optimism, but in rigorous analysis of what pathways actually exist towards flourishing within the system. I couldn't think of a more timely conversation to have. So without further ado, Ted, I hand it over to you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ruth, and hello, everyone. I'm speaking to you from the west coast of North America, from the campus of Royal Roads University on Vancouver Island, southern Vancouver Island. We are on the territory of the Lekwungen-speaking people and the Songhees and Esquimalt nations, the unceded territory. I would welcome you all here to this magnificent landscape and to visit us at some point in the future. We enjoy the conversations that arise when we have interesting people coming to Vancouver Island to work with us. So today I'm going to talk, as Ruth mentioned, about the latest insights we've derived and the latest our latest understanding of what we call the Polycrisis core model, or the PCM. This is a model of interacting global systems that in its current version makes predictions about likely states of the global system of systems in 2040. It's very rigorous. It's grounded in a methodology called cross-impact balance assessment. I have about 40 minutes. I'd like to take you through some of the details of the model, even some of the mathematics if we have a bit of time. I've added some new material to my presentation for those of you who have seen earlier versions of this presentation. And the team has made some quite significant breakthroughs in the last 2 weeks that resolve some concerns we had about some of the implications of the model. So I'll share my slides now, and we'll get into the details. Excuse me. I seem to have I'm going to just quickly adjust things here. And make sure we're on the first slide, not the last slide. And it takes a moment to load, but you should see presentation mode.
Yep, there we go. Tad, it looks good.
So I want to begin this presentation with a few reflections on the deep history of global modeling. Some of you may have been around long enough to remember this publication back in 1972. The Limits to Growth. It was a report on the first true integrated global model call it here the granddaddy of world models. It's sort of the precursor of everything else that's been done in this area. It came out of a team working at MIT, or with the support of MIT. If you're interested in seeing an assessment that I've made of this particular model, there's a video at the link. This deck is, I'm quite happy to have it circulated afterwards, and you'll find a video at the link. So the limits to growth model was actually the first global model I worked with at the University of Victoria, not far from where I'm sitting right now. As an undergraduate, I rode away with the snail mail in those days and sent a money order to some outfit in the United States, got back 900 punch cards. Each card in the box was a line of Fortran code, represented a line of Fortran code. And I worked with the World 3 model for about 6 weeks at the University of Victoria when I was taking a computer science course at the university. So I became quite familiar with the underlying mechanics of the model and the underlying mathematics. And it produced dot matrix printouts like this, showing the trajectories of various macro variables at the global level, as you can see. This is what's called the standard run. And if you put a timeline across the bottom, it shows that global population crashes somewhere around the middle of this century. Because of an accumulation of pollution and declining resource availability, crisis in the global food system, and various other stresses. So the key thing I want to note here is that World 3 applies a modeling approach called system dynamics that was developed by Jay Forrester at MIT in the 1950s through 1970s. And it consists of coupled differential equations. Basically, to understand the model, you have to know something about calculus. And that makes it really quite opaque. It's not a model that can be used easily by people. And there are other implications of the high level of mathematics of the equations within the model, the sophisticated mathematics of the equations within the model. In particular, when it comes to the kinds of data that you can integrate into the model. Statisticians and scientists who work with a lot of data, especially social scientists, make a distinction between 4 levels of data measurement: nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. And you can see in this slide that I've indicated what the distinctions are. So nominal level of measurement, of data measurement, would be something like a variable like gender, where you have categories, male, female, and other or whatever that have no order between them. They're just named categories. Ordinal level data. In this case, you actually can rank the various levels of the variable. But the intervals between those levels are indeterminate. So an example would be education level, high school, bachelor's degree, master's, doctorate, etc. Then there's interval level data. And in this case, you have order and equal intervals on a scale, but there's no 0 point. And so you can think of temperature as we measure it in Celsius or Fahrenheit. There is a consistent difference as you go from one level of temperature to another, from say 100 to 101 degrees to 102 degrees. The incremental difference is the same, but there's no 0 point. Then you have finally ratio level data where it has all the previous, the data at this level has all the previous properties that just indicated it's rankable, it's ordered, etc. And it also has a 0 point. And with ratio level data, you can apply all the apparatus of advanced mathematics. Now, the point that I want to emphasize here is that system dynamics, which is still widely used for global modeling, requires essentially ratio level data. It requires ratio level inputs. And that tends to bias the modeling using system dynamics towards measurable physical processes, because social processes tend to be fuzzier, and in terms of the kinds of understandings of them we have and the data that we extract to measure social processes. And as a result, they tend to be neglected or poorly represented in models that are grounded or structured using system dynamics. So most expert knowledge about social mechanisms, as I mentioned, is fuzzy. It's based on deeply informed pattern recognition, often accumulated through decades of understanding and studying the systems that an expert is working with. And it's expressed in nominal or ordinal statements of the type that I have here. If X happens, then I have a low to medium or high confidence that Y will happen somewhere else in the system that I happen to understand. The key thing here that I want to emphasize is that the cross-impact balance method can effectively integrate into a single analysis large amounts of this kind of data. In other words, we can integrate data from expert elicitation of all levels. So you can incorporate into cross-impact balance data, if you have it, you can incorporate ratio or interval level data, but you can also incorporate nominal and ordinal data. And it makes it much more flexible as an integrative mechanism and a platform to understand relationships between not just physical systems at the global level, but also social systems. So before I get into the details of the model, I just want to tip my hat to the team, the Cascade Institute team that has been working on this diligently, very hard, and with very exciting results over the last 2 years, really, more than 2 years. Mike Lawrence, Megan Shippen, both of whom are with us today, Luke Kemp, many of you know Luke, Simone Philpott, Scott Janswood, Kazra Motlagzadeh, and he has just joined us. So excuse me to Kazra because I'm still having some trouble in pronouncing his last name. And Catherine Matos Meza, who is working with us on research. And I also want to tip my hat to the gentleman who developed cross-impact balance analysis originally, and that is Wolfgang Weimer-Yelle, now Professor Emeritus at Stuttgart in Germany. This is, I think, a truly remarkable method, and I'm hoping that the Cascade Institute and perhaps in collaboration with ASRA can try to bring more attention to this method and make sure that it's more widely used. I think it was in 1973 that Vasily Leontiev won the Nobel Prize for input-output analysis, the Economic Nobel Prize. I'm very familiar with input and output analysis. It's widely used in economic modeling. I think that this method is equally insightful, if not more insightful and more powerful. So it would be good to make sure that as many people are aware of it as possible. So the Polycrisis core model, as we've designed it, disaggregates the world into 11 subsystems. And you can see the 11 subsystems here. These subsystems are called descriptors. You notice that in the World 3 model, the printout or the dot matrix chart that I showed you before, there are a number of macro variables: pollution, population, agriculture, and the like, resources. That was the way World 3 disaggregated the world. We are disaggregating in a slightly different way, although there's some resonance or some similarity between the way we've, to use the philosopher's expression, carved reality at the joints. And necessarily, this is a model that is what Murray Gell-Mann, the Nobel physicist, would call a crude look at the whole. It's a very highly aggregated. It's very coarsely grained. There's a lot of detail, enormous detail, potentially in each one of these 11 subsystems. We can get into how we unpack some of that detail in a few minutes. We are examining causal relationships along every single line that you can see in this diagram. This, by the way, I didn't know this ahead of time, but a polygon with 11 sides is called a hendecagon. Each of these descriptors has a set of potential states. As you can see here, we've grouped them into social and material categories. You may have a little bit of trouble reading this. I'm going to enlarge this table in a moment so you can see it a bit more clearly. So there are 11 descriptors. There are 6 we designate social, and 5 the other way around. 6 we designate material, and 5 we designate social. And each one of these descriptors has between 3 and 5 possible discrete states. So at any time between now and 2100, we would say that each one of these systems, for instance, if you look at climate there, it has 3 possible states in 2100. Under 2.5 degrees Celsius, 2.5 to 4 degrees Celsius, and over 4 degrees Celsius. Let me enlarge the table so you can see it a little bit better. Here are the social descriptors, and you can see the states that we designate for each one. Now, the exercise of carving reality at its joints is in some respects an arbitrary one. Every one of these descriptors in our model is accompanied by an extended scientific essay or scientific statement explaining in particular why we've identified the particular states as possibilities between now and 2100, as possible states of that descriptor between now and 2100. And that will all be publicly available. When we publish the results of the model, it'll be part of the supplementary information, and it can be critiqued. There will be certainly people who think that we've made mistakes about the way we have distinguished the descriptors or distinguished the states within descriptors. All of this is corrigible in the sense that it's open to conversation and open to change. Here are the material descriptors along with the various states. So we have most of the states have either most of the descriptors have either 3 states or 5 states. There are a few that have, as you can see for energy there, have 4 possible states. We can get into the details of these states at some point in Q&A if you want to know more about it, but we need to show how the model emerges from this structure. So CIB analysis involves constructing a matrix that stipulates the causal relationship between every state of every descriptor and every state of every other descriptor. And this is our whole matrix. It has 1,830 some judgments in it. I'll show you how those work in a moment. And basically, it's arranged this way. All descriptors and their states are represented on both matrix axes. So you can see down the left-hand side there, polity type, world order, conflict and security, information technology, economy, health. So you're seeing for each descriptor, polity type, you see the 5 possible states that we designate for polity type, for world order, the 5 possible states for world order, conflict and security, etc. And then across the top, you've got exactly the same descriptors and exactly the same states for each descriptor. And so a number in a cell in the matrix represents the relationship, the posited causal relationship between the state of one descriptor and the possible states of another descriptor, which is exactly what we say here. Causal relations are represented using a Likert scale from +3 to -3. Each score indicates a level of confidence. So for those of you who know statistics, this is we're taking a Bayesian, not a frequentist approach to the scoring process. So each score indicates a level of confidence in a promoting or inhibiting causal impact of one descriptor state on another descriptor state. So you can see it's illustrated below. We're saying with the 3 in the cell that's circled in the red oval there, that if the state of nonocracy substantially prevails in 2040, and nonocracy is a situation of weak or failing states and governmental institutions. So widespread, weak, or failing governmental institutions around the world. If that is the prevalent state of form of polity type in 2040, we're saying that we have a high confidence, that's what the 3 indicates, that that prevailing polity type will lead to fragmentation of the world order. So the 3 indicates a high confidence of a promoting effect of nonocracy on fragmentation of the world order. A negative number indicates that we believe the state in question, nonocracy, would inhibit that particular state of the other system. So the -2 that you see there, 3 columns to the right, in the same row, under rules-based world order, indicates that we think that nonocracy would inhibit the development of rules-based order, but we're slightly less confident in that. We feel slightly less confident of the inhibitory effect. So the entire matrix is populated with numbers between -3 and +3. Zeros indicate that either we felt there was not enough information to make a judgment about a causal relationship between one state of one descriptor and another state of another descriptor, or that there was a high level of uncertainty, or that there were countervailing causal influences that we thought might cancel each other out. And we were very conservative. If we felt that that there was reason to doubt our judgment, and if we ended up, when we got together for 5 days to do the final scoring of this matrix in April, the whole team. If we were debating it a lot and couldn't come to a conclusion, we often put zeros in. Critically important is scores in a judgment group add to 0. There are 2 powerful insights that Weimar Yele has contributed in this modeling approach. I would say methodological moves that make this a particularly powerful method, and this is one of them. So a judgment group is the full set of possible outcomes that a particular state of one system might produce, of one descriptor might produce in the states of another descriptor. So that yellow highlighted row there is the full judgment group for the effect of nonocracy on world order. And you'll notice that those numbers add up to 0. What this implies is that you have to balance your judgments. You have to allocate confidence across all possible outcomes. So if you feel really strongly that something is going to happen, that the state of nonocracy is going to produce something like fragmentation, then you have to feel equivalently strongly that some combination of other states are not going to happen. So that's the balancing constraint that you face when you do this scoring. And it turns out to be a very powerful way of disciplining one's assertion of causal judgments when you are scoring the matrix. The matrix includes 1,830 individually empirically grounded causal judgments about likely causal relations between descriptor states in 2040. They are grouped in 110 judgment sections. Each judgment section is essentially a submatrix that represents the effect of one descriptor on another descriptor. And here we see, I've just pulled this out of a portion of the matrix. This is the judgment section representing the effect of world order on the world economy. So all of these 1,830 judgments in the matrix we're in the process. I think the team has pretty well finished the process of writing up the empirical grounding for each of the judgments, judgment section by judgment section. So there are 110 independent statements of the empirical rationale for the judgments in this model. Okay, so that's the structure of the matrix. Now, how do we actually find out what the matrix tells us about the future? The 45 states across the 11 descriptors generate over 4 million scenarios or possible world futures. So basically, each scenario represents one state of each descriptor. And you can see here's a scenario on the right. I just highlighted one state for each descriptor. And the total number of possible combinations of states of all the descriptors is over 4 million, 4,050,000. So there are 4,050,000 possible world futures representing all the possible combinations of the states of the descriptors. The CIB math determines which of these scenarios are consistent in the sense that, given the causal relationships in the entire matrix, they are self-reinforcing equilibria. Now, some of you may have heard my conversation with Ruth just in advance of this session. I've added into this deck a number of slides on the math itself. I'm looking at the amount of time we have. I think that I'm going to just jump over those slides, but if anybody wants to look at the deck, they're in the deck, and they provide a very clear introduction to the basic math. This is important because normally when people present cross-impact balance assessment, the math is a black box. It's not explained effectively. And certainly in all my presentations up to this point, I've just said, oh, and then there's math. And the math is executed by a software program called Scenario Wizard, and it produces these results. I don't think that's adequate. I think that people need to understand exactly what's happening. And so in this deck, there's now a full description of the basic logic of the mathematics that cross-impact balance analysis uses. And the basic logic is elaborated in the next two paragraphs of this slide. The mathematical process, as I say, executed by a program Weimar Yele developed called Scenario Wizard, adds up a given scenario's total causal impacts for each state of each descriptor. And if the state with the largest causal impact in a given descriptor is the same as the scenario's input state for that descriptor, then the scenario is consistent for that descriptor. And if that last statement sounds completely opaque to you, the one at the bottom of the screen, don't worry. It takes quite a while to actually wrap your head around what is happening with this mathematics. But once you do, you think, wow, that is very clever and it's very powerful. So as you can see, I've got an example here, but I'm going to just skip over this, and people can look at this independently if they like. So of the Polycrisis core model's 4,050,000 scenarios, it turns out that only 11 are fully consistent, which means that they are consistent across all descriptors. And one way of thinking of this is that all their input and output states are the same. They are self-reinforcing. In the language of complexity scientists, they exhibit homeostatic equilibria. They have a series of internal positive feedbacks that keep them stable. These 11 fully consistent scenarios can be considered attractors in an 11-dimensional state space. Now, it's just a coincidence that we happen to have 11 attractors and we have 11 descriptors. There are 11 descriptors in the model, 11 systems that we are looking at for which we're exploring the causal relationships between. And it just turns out as a coincidence that the full matrix produces 11 attractors, 11 states that are fully consistent. So just ignore the fact that it's 11 and 11. But do think about this idea of an 11-dimensional state space. We live in a 3-dimensional space, but you can think of the model as producing a space where each system is a dimension in the space. The food system, the climate system, the economy, the world polity, or the world order system. Each of those can be considered a dimension in the state space, and then you have the states within that descriptor represent possible positions along that dimension. Now, I'm just going to give you an example of the first run of some examples from the results from the first run of the Scenario Wizard using the matrix that we developed. This is a very large attractor, and I'm going to explain what that means in a moment. But this number at the top that you can see here, the 1,009,056, indicates that of the 4 million scenarios, 4,050,000 scenarios in the entire, that the model is processing, 1 million of them end up, 1,009,000 end up being attracted into this, drawn into this basin of attraction. And it has the characteristics you see there for each of the descriptors: polity type, the state is a liberal democracy, world order, fragmentation of world order, a lot of a civil and proxy war in terms of the kind and level of violence, unmanaged rollout of artificial intelligence, low economic growth, etc. You see the results there. It's not a very happy state from 2040, but it looks entirely plausible given the trajectory the world is on right now. Here's one that looks even worse. We call this Mad Max. In this case, we have weakening or failed states around the world, fragmentation of the world order, widespread non-state violence. That means basically criminality and breakdown of order within societies. So in the information economy, we're seeing a breakdown of scientific innovation. We have a collapse of the world economy. People are sick, and people are starving, and there is global failure of both the energy system and energy innovation. High levels of inequality. Not a happy place. I think of this as Haiti writ large at the global level. But we also have this additional attractor and consistent scenario, which we are now calling the Hope Attractor. And this is the one that Ruth was alluding to in her opening remarks. This is the 11th scenario. In this run, it had a much smaller basin of attraction. You see it's attracting in only 11,000 inconsistent scenarios. It's deeper though. The total impact score that you see there is a measure of the depth of the basin. So if you can get there, it's relatively stable. In later runs of the model, changing the process we call succession analysis, which I'll discuss in just a moment, we're finding that this attractor is actually larger. It has closer to 100,000, a weight of 100,000. But notice the characteristics. It's democratic, low levels of global violence, strong, competent governmental institutions managing the rollout of artificial intelligence. The economy is growing, people are healthy, people are well fed. You're seeing a lot of scientific innovation. It's still hot, and that's a concern. And it's definitely a factor that is weakening the stability of this particular attractor. We can talk a little bit about that. But overall, it's an enormous improvement in human well-being. So I highlighted this number at the top called weight. I just want to talk about that for a minute. I have about another 5 minutes, and then we'll get into our conversation. I said that this weight represents the width of the basin of attraction. There's a process called succession analysis that is applied by the Scenario Wizard software. Again, in this deck, I explain how succession analysis works in simple terms. But the key thing is that it moves any one of the inconsistent scenarios. And remember, there are 4,050,000 minus 11 inconsistent scenarios. It moves each one of these inconsistent scenarios step by step, making it steadily more consistent through the state space to the heart of one of the 11 attractors, basically to one of the stability equilibria in the system. And I've got a little diagram here. You can think of this. I'm showing a three-dimensional state space because we can't, of course, represent an 11-dimensional state space, but you can think of these attractors as basically a bit like gravity wells or maybe even black holes within the state space. What the scenario succession analysis does is it shows how a inconsistent scenario will migrate through the state space over time through a series of steps and then ultimately end up in one of the 11 attractors, one of the 11 consistent scenarios. It becomes one of the 11 consistent scenarios. The width of the attractor, or its weight, you saw that terminology before in CIB terminology, is a function of the number of inconsistent scenarios that migrate towards it. And I'm going to skip over this succession analysis, the details on succession analysis and these here, and just come to these last slides. For those of you who've seen earlier versions of this presentation, we have changed several things to make especially the process of succession analysis more realistic, to reflect more what's more likely to happen in the world. What we have done here, though, is we've represented all of the 11 attractors, all of the 11 consistent scenarios that are self-reinforcing in a two-dimensional state space that represents well-being, material well-being and social well-being. So we rescored all of the descriptors and their states according to their according to our subjective values within the team, their normative value, whether they were good or bad, and then we positioned each of the 11 attractors within this two-dimensional state space. As you can see here, Mad Max is the one in the bottom left-hand corner. It's big. According to our latest runs of the model, it's grown substantially in size. I don't know what its attractor weight now is, but it must be somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million scenarios. Then you have a cluster in the middle of scenarios that 8 of which or 9 of which have illiberal democracy as a key characteristic. And so we lump those together into one large attractor. And this is what we end up with. There's Mad Max again. We have the illiberal democracy attractor, which is the largest of all. That's the consolidation of the 8 or 9 that are states, consistent states that have a liberal democracy in them. There's one significant autocracy attractor. And then there is the Hope Attractor, what we call the Hope Attractor, which is, as you recall from the results that I showed you a moment ago, is dramatically more positive in terms of human well-being. And now represents around 100,000. It has a width or basin of attraction of about 100,000 scenarios. So it's substantially larger than it was than in our first run of the model, based on some changes we've made to succession analysis that we think are reasonable. One thing I want to point out is that the distance between the red X, showing where we are right at the moment, and the Hope Attractor is not a good indication of how difficult it is for us to get to the Hope Attractor. Instead, it's an indication of the distance there is between where we are right now and the quality of life that we would have if we were in the Hope Attractor. So it would involve an enormous improvement in human well-being if we were able to migrate there. One of the principal things that the PCM team is doing right at the moment is what we call a full pathways analysis to determine what are the most plausible routes to the Hope Attractor. Now, forget about the slide I just showed you, which was a two-dimensional well-being state space. We're back in the 11-dimensional state space here. You think about that there are these attractors distributed. I've labeled one of them attractors distributed through the state space. I've labeled one of them the Hope Attractor. If we sort of posit that humanity is somewhere in this state space and that's outside the Hope Attractor, then the question we're asking is, how do we get to the edge of that basin? What policy moves do we need to make in order to get to the edge of that basin? I'm really excited to say that in the last couple of weeks, Megan and Mike and ASRA in particular have made enormous progress in identifying the subset of pathways into the Hope Attractor that are closest to where we are right now. So just to translate that, the Hope Attractor is drawing in about 100,000 inconsistent scenarios. We want to know which of those inconsistent scenarios are closest to where we are right now, that involve the smallest number of policy changes to get to the point at which we have basically self-reinforcing succession processes that could draw us into the heart of the Hope Attractor. This, by the way, echoes some research that was done years ago by people like Ben Cashore at Yale University, who's emphasized that in trying to achieve macro social change, we need to leverage as much as possible positive feedbacks. We want to get ourselves to places socially where things take on a kind of runaway effect of self-reinforcing virtuous cycles that lead us to a better place. What the model helps us understand is where those starting points might be and what things we need to do to try to get to the places where we start to have those self-reinforcing processes. So I'm just 2 minutes late. I think I'll end with this slide, which we feel is very evocative, and maybe we can have some conversation.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Tad. Super interesting. And obviously your team has been hard at work. So thank you so much for sharing that with us today. We do have a couple of questions in the Q&A. So the first one is from David Gunn, and he asks, when you say Mad Max is growing, can you describe how the running of the model is changing? Is this about changing the causal assumptions, -3 to +3, or something else?
That's a really, really good question. So when I said Mad Max grew. It grew between our early runs and our later runs of the model. And one of the key things we changed, and this is in some of the slides I didn't show, is we changed our approach to succession analysis. So let me explain a little bit. And it was Mike Lawrence who made this breakthrough, and it's really, really significant. It's not the case that when you're moving through the state space that a move between one state and another that you can move from simply any state to any other state within a descriptor. So let me unpack that. If you are moving, if the level of heating is changing in the climate, you can't go from less than 2.5 degrees immediately to 4 degrees, to greater than 4 degrees. You have to transit through the intervening stage, which is 2.5 to 4. If you remember, for climate, we had less than 2.5, 2.5 to 4, and over 4 in terms of trajectories out to 2100. If there's a change in your states in the system with respect to climate, you're going to have to change consecutively. You're going to have to move through that order. It turns out that for each of the descriptors, we can designate fairly clearly what the possible order of change might be. It's not always just linear the way it is with climate. It's sometimes, and we call these things constellations. It turns out that there are some fairly complex possible routes that can be followed between the states within a particular descriptor. Mike unpacked those. He analyzed them. He provided for each descriptor basically a statement. We call them constellations. They actually look like star constellations, a statement of possible routes where you could go from one state to another state with a particular descriptor. And then we loaded all of that into Scenario Wizard, which constrained the succession processes significantly. It made the succession process much more realistic. I won't tell you how Scenario Wizard did it previously, but it wasn't terribly plausible for the kind of system we're looking at. When we did that, the Hope Attractor, both the Hope Attractor and the Mad Max Attractors became much larger. So we think these are now more realistic representations of what the possibilities are in 2040. We didn't change any numbers. To go to your question, we didn't change any numbers in the matrix. All we changed was the succession analysis process and we made the succession analysis much more realistic. You can see the details in the slides if you want to take a look there. But I will say that the heuristics or the rules you use for succession analysis are incredibly important in terms of determining how powerful particular basins of attraction are, how many scenarios they're attracting in. And so we need to get them right. I hope that answers the question, if I interpreted it correctly.
Pat, I'm going to lump a bunch of questions because they're a bunch of very specific questions around sort of the details of the model. So if I can just throw them all kind of into one. There are a lot of questions here, so I'm not going to get them all, but let's just start with three. Dan Hoyer would like to know about the judgments that are empirically grounded. Can you explain more about what the empirical assessments used to ground these judgments look like? Where does that empirical data come from? How is it analyzed, et cetera? So empirical data. You also mentioned the changes between model runs. How often are you updating those scores, assumptions, and planning? And then thirdly, does the model include a sense of timescales? For example, if migrating from inconsistent to attractor state, is there a range of timescales associated? So there's three questions, just to dig into the details a little bit more.
There's a great question. So on Dan, for Dan, hi Dan. We're really sweating the details on this, like hugely. And there's going to be almost 200 pages of supplemental information associated with this model. So for each judgment section, there will be a statement of the research that was used and the rationale behind the numbers in the judgment section. Now, that may not be sufficient, may not be adequate. People may argue with it, but nobody's going to be able to say that we haven't thought about each one of these things. We're not pulling these numbers out of the ether, which, by the way, is a problem with system dynamics, and it's something that I realized when I was working with World 3 back all those like 50 years ago. I kept looking at the model and saying, so where did they get these parameters? And it turns out that in many cases, they just had to estimate some of the most critical numbers in the model because there was not much empirical evidence one way or the other for factors and parameters that turned out to be really important, rates and things. In this case, people will be able to look at what we've done and they'll make judgments about whether we've done it correctly or not. One of the important things about CIB is that it's both legible and corrigible. Okay, as opposed to systems dynamics. And by this, I mean that people can understand what's being done in the model. We're going to make all of this information public, and they can go in potentially and change the numbers or even change the model structure and run it the way they think is appropriate. So that's very powerful. It means that it can become a very democratizing exercise in research, scientifically grounded research. But don't worry, that there's going to be there are a lot of citations. Huge amount of citations. And we had Luke Kemp involved, and Luke was always saying, well, the literature says this and the literature says that. So we're on it. Okay, so the second one, the model runs. I'd like to think that we are converging into some kind of limit here in the sense that we are learning how to do this right. We are going back into we're going to do sensitivity testing on the numbers in the matrix itself to see how sensitive, say, the Hope Attractor is to changes and specific judgments within the model. We're going to we're improving the succession analysis rules. And I think this is a major step forward. I think this may actually turn out to be very valuable for the entire CIB community. I think there will be a point at which we have done the best we can with the structure of the model that we have provided so far. And it may be ultimately that we need to do a different model for a different purpose. So for instance, if we're advising, say, reinsurance firms, we might have to unpack the economy descriptor from one global economy descriptor into, say, 3 or 4 economy descriptors that do different things. But this will be a basic platform, very much the way World 3 was a platform. It'll be a basic platform for research that people can use and can start to modify. And one thing we want to do once the platform is stable and we feel that we've got to a point where we're not getting a lot of return on investment in terms of improving the results of the model, is we want to implement something we call switches, which would be exogenous shifts to the global system that are somewhat stochastic. So it might be something like an H5N1 pandemic or an asteroid hit or a nuclear war. I'm talking all bad ones. There could be some good ones. Geoengineering. Some country like India decides to geoengineer. And we actually have that as a descriptor, and then we can turn it on and off at various levels, like mild geoengineering, medium geoengineering, global geoengineering, knocking the temperature back 1.5 or 2 degrees. So we could turn those on and then we could see what the effects would be as they propagate through the matrix and what the implications are for stability. So there's a lot of stuff. Once we got the platform ready, there's going to be a lot of stuff we can do. Time in the model, the last question. So this would involve a longer conversation. But one thing I want to say is that, for instance, in the paper that AJ shepherded through with Nature, I'm co-author on that paper, the one that sort of lays out a framework for risk analysis, very, very helpful paper. In figure 3, cross-impact balance analysis is listed as a causal accounting method. And I think that's true in part, especially when you do just the initial run without a succession analysis. You just set up the matrix and you add up the totals and you see, where the consistencies are and stuff like that, and you find the initial fully consistent sets. That's kind of an accounting consistent scenarios. That's like an accounting process. Once you start doing succession analysis, you are introducing an analog of time. The system is changing. The system is changing in steps as it migrates towards a stable attractor. We've had a conversation internally about whether we should be thinking of that as an instantaneous process or something that happens over time. And I think we'll have to leave that question a little bit open. But it makes the model dynamic. A lot of people think that CIB is a static process. It really is just an accounting mechanism. But as soon as you start doing succession analysis, you're introducing something that is similar to time in terms of the dynamics of the model itself. But we can have a standalone conversation about this if the person who asked the question wants to contact me.
Great, thank you. I'm looking at the time. There's some other sort of detailed questions, which maybe I'll just surface, but then I want to get to another question, which I'd love you to address, and maybe we can come back to others if we still have time. But I'm aware that we're approaching the top of the hour. So some of the other questions, Todd, that I think are really interesting. How does nature factor into this as opposed to climate? If you're taking into considerations the differences between global south, global north, what does that tell you? Do your judgments differ depending on your worldview and your perspective and where you're coming from? What does that mean? What about uncertainty? Are you factoring in uncertainty in this model, or is this model considered to be certain because you've got so many data points? Those are just some of the very interesting questions that came up. I think.
But why don't I do one sentence in each of those?
Okay,
very
awesome. Thank you.
Uncertainty is all through the model. It's factored all the way in. And that's, I mentioned it when I was talking about the zeros and things like that. So we are very, very responsive to the reality of uncertainty. And we're going to be highlighting that in much of the supplemental information. Yes, the judgments are influenced by worldviews. The material judgments somewhat less so than the social judgments, especially the normative scores that position those attractors in the normative state space. Those are highly subjective. We're being very open about that, and then people can decide. Again, it's a corrigible model. They can go in, they don't like our judgments, they change the judgments, they run the model with their own judgments. We have found, though, that the Hope Attractor is fairly resilient to changes in the judgments. We went in and made a whole bunch of judgments as we were refining the matrix, and the Hope Attractor stayed. So it seems to have withstood a first round of sensitivity testing. Global South, Global North, you'll see that there was an equality descriptor in there, and that relates directly to the differences between Global South and Global North. Now, it's very crude, admittedly, but we're extremely sensitive to that within the model. And then nature versus climate. The climate variable is there as a proxy for Earth systems, including biodiversity, on the assumption that if climate gets really bad, then all other natural systems start to fall apart. Again, it's crude, it's very aggregated, but we're being very explicit about that. We will probably, in the published version of this model, call that descriptor Earth system instead of climate. Okay, almost the same.
Thank you. Okay, so final question. Now what? I would like to move into the political of this because I think first of all, everybody's hungry for hope. Secondly, ASRA, as one organization, all of our members are very keen on not just the assessment side, but the response side. How do we actually move into mitigation of risk, adaptation to risk, and ultimately transformation, where we need to truly transform our actions and activities. So there are a number of questions about, what do you do with this? Like, where do we find the levers of change in this model, given what it's telling us? And as Tamsin Ratcliffe asked very eloquently, how do we command hope?
Yeah. Okay. So I'm glad we're ending with this, because this is really, I think, one of the most significant breakthroughs just in the last couple of weeks. I talked about what Mike had done with his constellations, with his succession orders, very, very helpful. Megan and Kazra too have worked out a way, and I mentioned this at the end, but I was going fast and may not have sunk in. It worked out a way of establishing the points closest to the Hope Attractor that we can get to. So basically what they've done is they've taken 100,000, roughly 100,000 scenarios that migrate to the Hope Attractor. So those are 100,000 pathways into the Hope Attractor. You think of them as pathways. And I had this kind of in the diagram. You want to look for those pathways that are closest to where we are right now, that involve the smallest number of changes and the most feasible and plausible changes at the policy level, so that we can get to the start of that pathway. Supposedly, according to the model, once we're on that pathway, these positive, deterministic, somewhat positive feedback loops kick in, and it draws you in that positive direction. But first of all, we have to be big agents to jump the leap, to get to the edge of the basin of attraction, right? Or to jump the gap, to leap the gap, to get to the edge of the basin of attraction. So what Megan identified, and this is, I didn't show this because it's brand new, is that there are about 3 or 4 of the 100,000 pathways that provide relatively small number of changes that we have to make to find ourselves on a trajectory towards the Hope Attractor. So of the 100,000 inconsistent scenarios, 3 or 4 are close enough to us that it's plausible we could get to them. That provides us with very clear policy targets. And all I can say at this point is that watch this space. We will be reporting on exactly what those are. It looks like maintaining democracy is critically important. That if we don't maintain democracy, then there's probably no way there. Okay, but the fact that the model is telling us this is hugely significant. I would like to finish with one key point just in the last 30 seconds. What's really powerful about this, and what is really exciting us, is that these hopeful visions of the future, for the most part, have been somewhat aspirational and speculative in the past, in most scenario and foresight analysis processes. Instead, what this model is showing us, with 1,800 disaggregated, discrete judgments about very specific relationships between states of global systems to other states of global systems, it's showing us scientifically that a very positive outcome is still plausible. And it's not aspirational, it's in the data, right? And the succession analysis processes that Mike and Megan are implementing are actually going to show us what the most plausible pathways to the Hope Attractor are, in very practical ways, grounded again in these empirical data. So this is I think, a very, very significant finding, which is one reason we're racing to try to get it published. We're hoping to submit to Nature early in the new year.
Fantastic. Well, I hope you're successful in that, because as you say, this is incredibly important work. It's very inspiring. Kudos to the team. I think you've had many sleepless nights. And it's a huge contribution, not just to the thinking, but also to pathways towards action. So I really want to thank you, Tad, and the team. If you would like to learn more about Cascade's work and Tad's thinking and the team's thinking, check out their website. Also check out Tad's book, Commanding Hope. If you want to learn more about ASRA, please check out our website, asranetwork.org. Thank you to all the attendees for your questions, for your comments, for your interest. As I mentioned at the beginning, we will be sending out the recording, And we will send out the deck as well. Tad has offered to share that. So we will send that to all registrants by email, and it will also be on our YouTube channel. So we'll get that information to you. So thank you all. Again, thanks, Tad. And
Thank you.
I hope everybody has a good rest of your day and feels inspired by this presentation.